Hello, welcome to SBSJ. I have some branches with me and I have a donkey, so I think we're ready to talk about Palm Sunday today. I wonder how many of you watched the coronation of King Charles III last year. No matter what our views are on the monarchy, I think we all come with some expectations of him as king. For the most part, we tend to base these on what we already know of the British monarchy, what's happened in the past, and maybe also what kind of person Charles has shown himself to be over the years. For the optimistic among us, perhaps we base our expectations on what we hope the new monarch can be. And the story we're looking at today is a very familiar one, but it involves a group of people celebrating the arrival of a king, although in very different circumstances. In the Diocese of Hereford, this year marks the Year of Faith, and during Lent, our teaching has focused on building our faith. As we enter Holy Week, I thought we could continue that by considering the faith that people show in this story, reflecting as well on our own. So Palm Sunday marks the beginning of Holy Week, the week leading up to Jesus' death and resurrection. And it's arguably the most important time in the Christian calendar. And this week is bookended with joy and celebration, but with a great deal of mourning and confusion in between. And these events of Jesus riding into Jerusalem, sometimes referred to as the triumphal entry, they're one of the few occasions which are recorded in all four Gospels. That being said, it's interesting that today we're focusing on Mark's account, as he misses out some of the main things that we might associate with Palm Sunday. So, for example, he doesn't say that people waved palm branches, just branches that they cut from the fields. And he also doesn't say explicitly that Jesus rode on a donkey, just a colt, which could be a young horse. However, the point that Mark seems really keen to emphasize is that Jesus is welcomed into Jerusalem as a king. Now, Jerusalem would have been very busy at this time as Jewish people flocked to the temple to celebrate the festival of Passover. Passover is the festival in which Jewish people remember Yahweh, God, liberating his people from captivity in Egypt. And these events are recorded in the book of Exodus. According to Mark's account, Jesus had been making his way towards Jerusalem for some time, healing people, teaching, and building up quite a crowd of followers along the way. And I invite you today to think of yourself as a member of this crowd who'd been following Jesus, witnessing his miracles and hearing his teaching. The excitement was really building. Now, this story can seem quite strange to us in 21st century Britain, where the sight of someone riding a donkey and people waving plants around would probably raise a few eyebrows. However, according to N.T. Wright, these actions would have had immediate significance for the people at the time. A man riding a donkey would not have been unusual, but we will come back to that later. But the waving of branches would have brought to mind the arrival of another triumphant king 200 years before. N.T. Wright says this, quote, 200 years before, Judas Maccabeus defeated the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes, entered Jerusalem, and cleansed and rebuilt the temple. And the people waved ivy and palm branches as they sang hymns of praise. End quote. For those who aren't familiar, in Mark's account, the next day Jesus is said to enter the temple and drive out those who had been trading there. And these similarities of a triumphant king, of waving of branches, cleansing of the temple, would have been very familiar. They would not have been lost on the Jewish people who were living under Roman rule at the time. They were longing for liberation once again. And these events are recorded in the books of Maccabees, which aren't part of our Protestant biblical canon, so the list of books that we have as scripture, but for many other Christians around the world, they are. And it is thought that these books would have been read during Jesus's lifetime as well, and they form the basis of what is now Hanukkah. So, when Jesus is arriving on this colt, people laying down their coats, shouting Hosanna, which means save us or please save, and shouting, blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. What did they mean? What kind of king were they putting their faith in? Was it someone like Judas Maccabeus? Or further back, someone like King David? They mention David as they're shouting. Both of these were very human kings who represented for many the glory days when they were governed by their own people, not by foreign rulers like the Romans or the Syrians or the Babylonians. For some, the idea of a coming king was part of the promise that God's Messiah, which literally means anointed one, would someday come. The problem is that Christians today can read the words that the crowds were shouting and assume that they had the same expectation of a Messiah as we have today. As Christians today, we tend to take Messiah to mean Son of God or part of the divine Trinity. But in Jesus' time, that's not what they would have been expecting. There are promises in their scriptures of an anointed one, that's the word Messiah, but these were always human people, usually a king, a priest, or a prophet. It's not associated at that time with being divine or saving people from their sins. Knowing this can help us to understand how a crowd can be waving branches to welcome Jesus on Sunday and by Friday be shouting to crucify him. Their expectations may have been more of a human king promised to usher in a new glorious reign, or a military leader to overthrow the Romans. But this hope was soon crushed by Jesus' arrest, humiliation, beating, and death only a few days later. Their faith that God would liberate them was not wrong. They were right in that. But they could not yet grasp what that would mean. Remember, they didn't have the writings of Paul or the gospel writers, or, as we do, over 2,000 years of theologians thinking us through to help explain some of the theology behind what Jesus' death and resurrection achieved. So their faith may have been limited to more earthly liberation, but we can hardly blame them for that. Perhaps knowing this, Jesus seemed to be sending clues as to what kind of king he would be as the week progressed, starting with this small act of riding in on a humble colt. In the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew links this action to an Old Testament prophet, Zechariah. In chapter 9, verse 9, he says, "See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey." This passage goes on to state that this king, quote, will proclaim peace to the nations, end quote. By riding a colt, Jesus aligns himself with this image of peace and humility. Mark tells us that early in the week, after throwing out the money changers in the temple, Jesus teaches and reveals more about himself and about his kingdom. We and the gospel writers can see with hindsight what he meant, but we cannot judge the people around him for not understanding what would take the church hundreds of years to grasp. You could even argue we're still trying to get our heads around it today. So, finally, let's reflect on the faith of the crowd. They demonstrated faith in their expectations, which would lead to some disappointment as the week progressed. However, ultimately, the reality of Jesus as king far outweighed anything they had been expecting. So let's think ahead briefly to the week that follows and reflect upon how the crowd welcoming Jesus may have felt and how their faith may have been challenged. And I wonder, while I go through this list of the days of the week, where you find yourself today. So we have today, Sunday, Jesus' arrival after a long journey of miracles and teachings. The excitement has been building. It's finally happening. The feelings for this Sunday are excitement, hope, joy, celebration. Then early in the week, Monday to Wednesday, we have Jesus turning out those in the temple, challenging the status quo, and then teaching about his kingdom. People at this time may have felt challenged, but they also may have enjoyed the learning and the questioning. And then Thursday, we have the Last Supper and Jesus' arrest. Their faith at this time, I imagine, was underpinned by worry and fear and uncertainty. Then Friday, the trial and crucifixion. Here we can see horror, mourning, and trauma. And then Saturday, feelings of loss, hopelessness, disappointment. Which day of Holy Week do you find yourself in today? I'll read through the list again, but just with the emotions. And see where you think you are, where your faith is today. So do you find yourself on Palm Sunday? Excitement, hope, joy, and celebration. Perhaps you are in that early part of the week, feeling challenged, learning, questioning. Maybe you are on Thursday, feeling worry, fear, uncertainty. Maybe it's Friday for you, with a sense of horror, mourning, or trauma. Or Saturday, feeling loss, hopelessness, disappointment. Wherever you are in your faith, there is a place for you this Holy Week. You may want to take some time this week to reflect upon your faith. What do you expect of Jesus as King? Have those expectations been met? Or are you facing confusion and disappointment, maybe? Are you prepared to be surprised and challenged by Jesus? And while you reflect this week, I want you to be comforted in the knowledge that Easter is coming. Thank you.